Erebus watches have released a watch that is so big, so crazy, so unapologetic, that despite it going against the whole current, it might actually work. However, at 44mm in diameter, 245 grams in weight, and a wait time of 4 months until delivery, is this the watch for you, or rather, are you ready for this watch? Well, let's discover all of that in this video. First of all, what is this watch? It is an absolute monster, a deep dive watch from Erebus Watches, which is an Australian watch company that was founded by famous YouTuber Jody from the channel Just One More Watch and his business partner Steve. Of course, they have added many other great folk in this endeavor since then. And just in case you're wondering, the company sent me 3 different versions of these watches that I will be showing you here. I do not get to keep them. I don't get one afterwards. I'm not paid in any way. This is just so I can talk to you about this crazy watch. Well, crazy why? First, as we have alluded, because of the dimensions. We said 44, well, it is rather 44.2, and if you go ahead and measure with that helium escape valve, you can go all the way up to 44.5 in diameter. The height is something else at 16mm, and that is somewhere where I differ with the dimensions specified on the website. 22mm in log width. The super engineer bracelet tapers from 22mm to 20, so not a lot of a taper there. And on the clasp it goes up to 22.7, so a huge big clasp there. One dimension I have not talked to you about is the log to log, and that is where the magic of this watch operates, because you've got a log to log of only 48.7. For a comparison, remember that the famous Submariner is 48mm in log to log. So this watch is pretty much pulling a Seiko, giving you a huge diameter with a quite reasonable log to log, which makes it, dare I say, almost wearable. Check it here, my 6 3/4 inch wrist, 17 centimeters in circumference. It definitely wears big. It even wears massive. Still, it doesn't overhang my quite small wrist. But the other dimension that you should not neglect is the thickness of that bracelet. The bracelet thickness is 5mm, which is huge. Maybe it does not seem a lot to you, but you can actually feel it. And that is, I believe, to balance the whole head of the watch, which is massive. Same thing for the clasp that we have talked about, over 22mm, with of course a micro adjust system that is wonderful. In this bracelet you also get screw pins. However, this brutish watch is a little bit more refined than you would have thought. If you compare it with the Origin, you absolutely get a familiar airing here, but it is not the same watch, just bloated up. Even though it shares the same index shape, those squares, on the Titan they are applied and surrounded by a stainless steel frame. This time around, the Erebus logo is also applied, and the window at 6 o'clock, as to balance the watch correctly, is also framed. Those very thick hands help a lot with legibility, and when you put the thing in the dark, it will just not quit glowing. Supernova here, and just heaps and heaps of it. And you even get some on the etched logo on the crown. Next up, let's talk variety. As usual, Erebus Watches gives you a lot of options, and here they have gone with 9 different colors. 9, that is huge. You even get a very special PVD version that I am wearing here, which looks absolutely great. I'm not one for this kind of PVD or DLC black watches, but this one looks particularly interesting. You also get a meteorite dial, and you get all sorts of colors all over. Let's talk about the tricky subject of price. I say tricky because that will depend a lot on your market and therefore on your perception of the price. Let's talk base price. The base price, at least for me in Europe, of the classic version, no frills, so stainless steel and classic dial, is as of today 305 euros, and that kind of changes with the fluctuations of currencies. The PVD coated versions cost 340 euros, and the Meteorite is the most expensive at 393 euros. But then you have to add shipping costs depending on where you live in the world, and then you have to add, of course, the, for some people, deal-breaking taxes. That is not the company's fault, that is just the way the world works, as we have sadly been reminded of lately. One of the least exciting aspects of this watch is what is beating inside it, the classic Seiko NH35. But do I wish that they had put a Miura Series 9 on it and maybe shaved like 2 millimeters and added $100 or euros to the price tag? Well, maybe not. With this kind of watch I am content with an NH35, especially that you can almost not hear it through that big, huge case, which was not the case with the Origin. So, finally, who is this huge, hardcore diver intended for? I truly believe that it is intended for fans of the brand. And I do believe that they do know this at Erebus watches. It is my understanding that they're not producing as many of these. They do know that these are not going to be selling as well as the Origin, and certainly not as well as the Ascent. And that might be kind of a head scratcher. They released the Ascent to huge acclaim and huge sales. So did they just tone it down from here? I really believe, therefore, that this is intended for their very specific hardcore fan base. Besides from that, it is a watch that is quite attractive, I would say, at least much more interesting than the quite bland design of the Origin, because they have added many things and they have perfected that design. Spec to watch ratio, it is also really good, especially for those base versions. I truly believe that if you live in Australia and you pay $300 or 300 euros for the base version, for a 500 meter hardcore diver watch, it is good value. If you live in the EU and you end up paying like 450 euros or so for this kind of watch, then the value is a little bit more arguable. Same thing if you live in the US, but that is again for you to decide. I know that we in the EU don't like to pay more than the initial price that we are asked for. That is just a cultural thing. I know that people in the US don't mind that because they're much more used to it. But besides from that, once again, a really nice watch, a refined version of the initial Origin design, a watch that pulls the magic trick of making a huge watch wearable on middle-sized wrists, and for that it really needs to be commended. If you want to check more Erebus watches, I'm going to leave you here with the famous Ascent and with the Origin as well. I have reviewed both, and I'll be seeing you right away in those videos.